The growl of the Ford Model T's engine was a familiar beast, a low rumble that vibrated through the fine leather of the seats and into Evelyn Vance's very bones. It was the sound of her cage in motion. Outside, the city lights of 1925 streaked past the rain-slicked windows, a dazzling, unattainable blur of life and freedom. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of her husband's expensive cologne and the unspoken threat that always lingered between them. Walter Vance adjusted his silk tie, his reflection a severe mask in the dark glass. "Remember, Evelyn," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of cold steel, "you are a reflection of me. Tonight, you will be charming, you will smile, you will not wander." The last word was a stone dropped into a still, deep well. Evelyn's gloved hands clenched in her lap, the delicate fabric hiding the faint violet shadow on her wrist from where he had gripped her too tightly the evening before. "Of course, Walter," she murmured, her voice a practiced melodic whisper. It was the voice of a perfectly crafted doll, one that knew its place on the shelf. The car slowed, pulling up before a discreet, unmarked oak door, sandwiched between a tailor's shop and a darkened bakery. This was the Velvet Shadow, the city's most infamous and exclusive jazz clubber, a place where laws were merely suggestions and power was the only currency that mattered. Walter thrived in such places. He exited the car with an air of ownership, his chauffeur rushing to open Evelyn's door. As she stepped onto the wet pavement, the night air, cool and sharp, was a brief, shocking relief. From the street, one could only hear the faint, seductive pulse of a bass line, a heartbeat beckoning them into the dark. A sharp knock, a sliding peephole, and the door swung inward, releasing a wave of sound and smoke. The transition was dizzying. They stepped from the quiet, respectable night into a swirling, intoxicating world of sin and soul. The Velvet Shadow was a cavern of dimly lit glamour. Smoke from 100 cigarettes and cigars hung in the air like a permanent haze, catching the low, amber light from shaded table lamps. On a small stage at the far end of the room, a quintet played a slow, mournful blues tune, the saxophone weeping a story of lost love and late-night regrets. The patrons were a cross-section of the city's hidden life, flappers, with their shimmering, knee-length dresses and sharp bobbed hair laughing too loudly, stout politicians in three-piece suits whispering deals with men whose faces belonged in post office bulletins, fortunes being won and lost over quiet games of cards in shadowed alcoves. Walter's hand was a firm, possessive weight on the small of her back, guiding her through the throng. People noticed that more rather, they noticed him. Heads turned, voices lowered. Walter Vance was an industrial titan, a man who built skyscrapers and crushed unions with the same detached efficiency. Evelyn was his most prized acquisition, the beautiful porcelain ornament that proved his success. She kept her chin high, her smile a fragile painted thing, feeling the eyes of the room slide over her beaded Chanel gown, her ropes of pearls, her carefully waved auburn hair. They saw the gilded cage, not the frantic bird beating its wings within. A waiter led them to a prime table near the stage, one clearly held in reserve. Walter settled into his chair, expansive and commanding. 2 gins, he ordered, not bothering to ask Evelyn what she wanted. He never did. As he began to hold court with an acquaintance who approached their table, Evelyn allowed her guard to drop just a fraction. The music seeped it into her, the sorrowful notes of the saxophone, a perfect match for the ache in her own chest. She watched the singer, a stunning woman with skin the color of warm honey, who swayed as she sang, her eyes closed, lost to the melody. For a moment, Evelyn felt a pang of raw envy. To be so free, to pour one's heart out for all to see, to be the source of the music instead of just a silent listener. It was a fantasy as distant as the moon. Her life was a meticulously curated performance. The elegant luncheons, the charity balls, the perfect home managed with silent, fearful precision. Every dress she wore, every word she spoke, was approved by Walter. He had courted her with poetry and promises, but once the ring was on her finger, the poet had vanished, replaced by a jailer who demanded perfection and punished any flaw with a chilling quiet or a sudden sharp pain. She was lonelier in her grand mansion, surrounded by staff and finery, than she had ever been in her life. Her gaze drifted across the room, over the sea of faces lost in rhythm and bootleg liquor, and then her eyes locked with his. He was standing in a slightly raised section at the back of the club, half shrouded in shadow, leaning against a velvet-draped wall. He wasn't a part of the noisy revelry. He was the anchor around which it all turned. He wore a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light, tailored to perfection. His face was all sharp angles and quiet intensity, his dark hair combed back from his forehead. He wasn't classically handsome in the way of the matinee idols, but he possessed a raw, potent magnetism that commanded attention without demanding it. He was watching her. Evelyn felt a jolt, a current of electricity that shot through her entire body. It was common for men to look at her, their gazes filled with lust or envy or admiration for Walter's possession. But this was different. This man's eyes, a deep, startling grey, she could discern even from across the room, held none of that. There was no artifice in his stare. It was direct, unnervingly perceptive, and utterly still. He wasn't looking at the Chanel gown or the pearls. He seemed to be looking past them, through the carefully constructed facade, and into the terrified heart of the woman beneath. It felt as if he could see the bruise on her wrist through the kid skin glove, as if he could hear the silent scream trapped in her throat. For a fleeting, terrifying second, she felt completely, utterly exposed. Her first instinct was to look away, to retreat behind the mask of polite indifference Walter demanded. But she couldn't. His gaze held her captive, a silent conversation taking place across the smoky expanse. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition perhaps, a shared understanding of the darkness that lurked beneath beautiful surfaces. He was, she knew instinctively, a dangerous man. But the danger he represented felt different from the suffocating, domestic terror she lived with every day. His was the danger of the wild, of the unknown, of a world that operated on its own terms. A faint, almost imperceptible nod from him. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement. "I see you." The spell was shattered by Walter's voice, sharp and cold at her ear. "Who are you staring at?" Evelyn flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tore her gaze away, her cheeks flushing with a heat that was equal parts fear and something else, something she dared not name. "No one, dear," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "just admiring the singer." Walter followed her gaze to the stage, then scanned the room with narrowed, proprietary eyes. "This place is filled with riffraff. Don't draw attention." He took a sip of his gin, his eyes still sweeping the club, a king surveying his territory for any potential threat to his throne or his property. With a tremor in her hand, Evelyn picked up her own glass. She took a sip of the strong, illicit spirit, the burn in her throat a welcome distraction. She dared to glance back toward the alcove, her heart a frantic drum against the slow, steady beat of the bass. He was gone, vanished back into the velvet shadows from which he had emerged, leaving only the ghost of his intense, knowing gaze. But the impression of it was burned into her mind. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen not the wife of Walter Vance, but a prisoner. And in the depths of those cool grey eyes, she had not seen pity. She had seen a chilling, resolute understanding. It was the most terrifying and hopeful feeling she had ever known. Arthur Sterling did not build his empire on sentiment. He built it on observation, on understanding the intricate machinery of desire and desperation that made the city tick. His office, tucked away behind the bustling main room of the Velvet Shadow, was a testament to his nature. It was Spartan and functional. A large mahogany desk, a leather armchair, and a single unadorned window that looked out onto a grimy alley. The only luxuries were a crystal decanter of whiskey and the silence he commanded. Yet for 3 days since the woman in the beaded Chanel gown had graced his club, the silence had been disturbed. Her image was an unwelcome ghost, superimposing itself over his ledgers and business dealings. He saw her eyes, not just their color, a soft hazel that seemed to shift with the light, but the profound, ancient sadness swimming in their depths. He was a connoisseur of masks. Every person who walked through his door wore one, but hers was different. It was a masterpiece of social necessity, yet so fragile, he felt he could see the cracks from across the room. He had seen the way she held herself, with a stillness born not of poise, but of terror, and he had seen the faint shadow on her wrist as she reached for her glass. Arthur Sterling was intimately familiar with the marks of violence. On the third night, he summoned his right-hand man, Frank, a broad, quiet man with knuckles like walnuts and an unshakable loyalty. Frank entered the office and stood before the desk without a word. "Walter Vance," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look up from the glass of whiskey he was swirling. "I want to know everything. Business dealings, political ties, enemies. And his wife, Evelyn. I want to know where she came from, who her family is. I want to know what the servants whisper when the master is away." Frank simply nodded. "It will be done, boss." The information came 2 days later, delivered in a plain manila envelope. Frank's report was brutally efficient, painting a picture darker than Arthur had even imagined. Walter Vance was a sadist, a man who derived pleasure from control. He had isolated Evelyn from her family, a respectable but financially struggling lineage from upstate. He controlled her finances, her friendships, her very schedule. The whispers from a paid-off maid were the grimmest part, speaking of locked doors, of muffled cries, of sudden, unexplained accidents that left Mrs. Vance unable to attend social functions for weeks at a time. The bruise Arthur had seen was a mere footnote in a long, cruel story. Arthur folded the report, his jaw tight. The cold fury that settled in his chest was an old, familiar friend. It was the same fury that had driven him from the gutter to become one of the city's shadow kings. He had clawed his way to power to ensure no one could ever hold that kind of absolute, monstrous control over him again. Seeing it wielded against someone so defenseless was an offense to the world he had built. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Walter Vance's world was about to be dismantled. His opportunity came sooner than he expected. An invitation, embossed with the city's seal, arrived for the mayor's annual charity gala, a glittering affair where the city's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity. Normally, Arthur sent a hefty donation and ignored the event itself. He had no taste for the performative piety of the upper crust. But when his eyes scanned the list of patrons, he saw the name Mr. and Mrs. Walter Vance. He told Frank to have his tuxedo pressed. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a world away from the Velvet Shadow. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of shimmering gowns and starched shirt fronts. The air, thick with perfume and the bubbly fizz of champagne, rang with the sound of a string orchestra playing a gentle waltz. It was a perfect, polished illusion of civility and grace. Arthur moved through the crowd with a predator's quiet confidence. He was an anomaly here, and he knew it. The other men had inherited their wealth, or made it in boardrooms. He had made his in back alleys and speakeasies, They saw him as a necessary evil, a man to be dealt with but never accepted. He couldn't care less. His eyes scanned the room, searching. He found her near the French doors that led to a snow-dusted balcony. She was a vision in a gown of deep emerald silk that clung to her slender frame. She was playing her part perfectly, a serene smile on her lips as Walter spoke with a portly city councilman. But Arthur saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers worried the stem of her champagne flute. He kept his distance, watching. He saw Walter's hands snake around her waist, his fingers digging into her side with a force that was clearly painful, even as he smiled blandly at the councilman. Evelyn's own smile tightened for a fraction of a second before she smoothed it back into place. It was a small, private cruelty, invisible to everyone but the man who was looking for it. The moment came when the councilman moved on. Walter turned to Evelyn, his voice a low, vicious hiss that Arthur was too far away to hear, but the effect was immediate. The color drained from Evelyn's face. She looked down, a silent, submissive gesture. Walter then did something so casually cruel it made Arthur's blood run cold. He took her champagne flute from her hand. "You've had enough, my dear," he said, his voice now loud enough for those nearby to hear, laced with condescending affection. "You get so clumsy." He deliberately tilted the glass, spilling the golden liquid down the front of her expensive emerald gown. A collective gasp went through the small circle of onlookers. Evelyn stood frozen, the cold champagne soaking through the silk, a dark stain spreading over her stomach like a wound. Humiliation burned in her cheeks, hotter than any slap. Walter looked on with a smirk of satisfaction. He had just reminded her, and anyone watching, of her place. Before anyone else could react, Arthur was moving. He closed the distance in 3 long, silent strides. He didn't look at Walter. His entire focus was on Evelyn. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a pristine, white linen handkerchief. "Allow me, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice calm and steady. He gently dabbed at the stain on her gown, his touch impossibly light. For a moment their eyes met over the handkerchief. He saw the shock, the confusion, and the flicker of recognition in her hazel depths. He gave her the briefest, most reassuring of nods. Walter stepped forward, his face contorted with fury. "And who the hell are you?" he snarled. Arthur straightened up slowly, turning to face him. He was a few inches taller than Walter, and where Walter was fleshy with wealth, Arthur was lean with a coiled, dangerous energy. "Arthur Sterling," he said simply. He looked at Walter directly in the eye, his gaze flat and cold as a winter lake. "It's a shame when a beautiful thing is treated so carelessly. It reflects poorly on the owner." The insult was exquisite in its delivery, a dagger wrapped in silk. He had called Evelyn a thing, and Walter its owner, using the very language of their toxic dynamic against them. It publicly framed Walter, not as a concerned husband, but as a clumsy proprietor of a possession he couldn't handle. Walter's face turned a mottled shade of purple. He was speechless, caught between the urge to lash out physically and the social necessity of maintaining his composure. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, utterly defeated by the quiet, unassailable confidence of the man before him. Arthur held Walter's gaze for a second longer, a silent promise of future conflict passing between them. Then he turned back to Evelyn. He pressed the handkerchief into her cold, trembling hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Vance," he murmured, his voice for her alone. Then, without another word, he turned and melted back into the crowd, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The ride home was a silent, terrifying ordeal. Walter didn't speak a word, but the rage radiated from him, filling the small space of the Model T until Evelyn felt she couldn't breathe. When they arrived at the mansion, he dismissed the chauffeur and dragged her inside, his fingers biting into her arm. The violence that followed was worse than usual, fueled by the public humiliation he had suffered. He was punishing her for Arthur's intervention, for her part in his shame. When he finally left her, sobbing on the cold marble floor of the foyer, a single desperate thought crystallized in her mind. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was all she had left. The next morning, her body aching with a constellation of new bruises, she found the pristine linen handkerchief clutched in her hand, where she had held it all night. It smelled faintly of whiskey and resolve. It was a promise from the shadow. With trembling hands, she penned a short, frantic note on her personal stationery. It contained no names, no details, just an address and a single desperate plea. Plaza Hotel, room 801. Tonight, please. She bribed the downstairs maid, a young girl whose pity she had occasionally glimpsed. With a pearl earring, one of the few things Walter hadn't bought her himself. "Take this to the Velvet Shadow," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Give it to no one but the owner. Tell them it is a matter of life and death." The note was not a surprise. When Frank laid the small, cream-colored envelope on his desk, Arthur felt a sense of grim inevitability settle over him. He slit it open with a letter opener, his movements economical and precise. The handwriting inside was elegant, but fraught with a spidery tremor. "Plaza Hotel, room 801. Tonight, please." A location, a time, a plea. It was more than enough. For a man like Walter Vance, his home was his castle, his fortress. For a man like Arthur Sterling, every fortress had a weakness. He spent the next few hours not in frantic preparation, but in quiet, methodical planning. Phone calls were made, hushed conversations were had in the back rooms of his club. He learned the layout of the Vance mansion from a former contractor who owed him a significant favor. He learned the nightly patrol schedule of the private security from a guard with a gambling problem. He learned that Walter Vance would be at his downtown gentleman's club until at least 2 in the morning, playing poker and drinking, Brandyar, predictable creature of habit. He didn't send his men. This was not a task to be delegated. This was a promise to be kept. Just before midnight, Arthur guided his black Duesenberg, a car as sleek and silent as a panther, through the deserted, tree-lined streets of the city's most affluent neighborhood. He parked in the deep shadows of an oak tree a block away from the Vance estate. The house was an imposing stone monolith, ablaze with lights on the ground floor, a declaration of wealth and power. But Arthur's eyes were fixed on a single, darkened window on the second floor, Evelyn's bedroom. His instructions to the maid had been simple. If she agrees, have her leave the light off. He waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity, marked only by the distant chime of a church bell and the rustle of wind through frozen branches. He was a patient man. He had learned in the trenches of France that waiting was half of any battle. Inside the mansion, Evelyn moved like a ghost. Her body was a symphony of pain, but her mind was fiercely, terrifyingly clear. After the maid had delivered the discreet, verbal reply, "He will come. Be ready," a strange calm had descended upon her. It was the calm of a person with nothing left to lose. She packed a small leather satchel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fasten the clasp. She took no jewelry, save for her mother's simple locket. She took a change of clothes, a book of poetry, and the white linen handkerchief. They were the only things in this house that felt like hers. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck 1, she heard Walter's heavy footsteps on the stairs, followed by the slam of his bedroom door. She waited, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs, until the sound of his snores began to rumble through the walls. Slipping out of her room, she moved down the grand curving staircase, her bare feet silent on the thick Persian runner. Every creak of the old house sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She reached the side door to the gardens, her designated exit, her breath held tight in her chest. The bolt was heavy and stiff. She put her entire weight into it, biting her lip to keep from crying out as it finally slid back with a dull, heavy thud. The cold that hit her was shocking, a physical blow that stole her breath. But it was the clean, sharp air of freedom. She pulled her thin coat tighter and ran, her feet stumbling on the frozen grass, towards the wrought iron gate at the edge of the property. As she cleared the gate, the Duesenberg emerged from the darkness, its engine a barely audible purr. The passenger door swung open before the car had even come to a complete stop. Arthur leaned across the seat, his face half hidden in shadow, but his eyes were a steady, reassuring presence in the night. "Get in, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and calm. She scrambled inside, pulling the heavy door shut. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. As the car pulled away from the curb, she didn't look back. She couldn't. Looking back meant acknowledging the years she had lost, the person she had been forced to become. She could only look forward into the uncertain darkness, towards the stranger sitting beside her. He drove them, not to the plaza, which he knew would be the first place Walter would look, but to a tall, discreet residential building overlooking the park. He led her to the penthouse, a sprawling apartment of clean lines, dark wood, and vast windows that showcased the glittering carpet of city lights below. It was masculine, elegant, and above all, safe. "You'll be undisturbed here," he said, taking her thin coat. He noticed her shiver, the fine tremor in her hands. He moved to a sidebar, pouring a small amount of amber liquid into a glass. "Brandy? It will help." She took the glass, her fingers wrapping around its reassuring warmth. The opulence of the room was overwhelming, but it was different from Walter's ostentatious display. This was a quiet, confident luxury. It was a sanctuary, not a showroom. For a long time they were silent. Evelyn stood by the window, watching the distant, tiny headlights of cars moving through the city, each one a life, a story, completely separate from her own. The realization that she was now one of them and Maud, her path, her own, was both exhilarating and terrifying. Arthur watched her, giving her the space she needed. He saw the complex emotions warring on her face. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but direct. "Why did you wait so long to leave him?" The question was not an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry, and it broke the dam of her composure. The story tumbled out of her, a torrent of whispered words and suppressed tears. She spoke of the courtship, the early days of suffocating affection that slowly curdled into obsessive control. She spoke of the isolation, the way Walter had systematically cut her off from friends and family, turning her into a beautiful island he alone could visit. She spoke of the fear, a constant, low-grade hum that became the soundtrack of her life, punctuated by moments of sharp, explosive violence. "I became a ghost," she finished, her voice barely a whisper, a reflection in his mirror. "I think I forgot there was a real person underneath. Until," she trailed off, looking at him, "until I saw you. In the club, you looked at me, and I felt real." Arthur listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When she was done, a profound quiet filled the room. He didn't offer empty platitudes or words of pity. Instead, he walked to the window and stood beside her, looking out at the same sleeping city. "Power is a dangerous thing," he said, his voice a low murmur, "especially for men who are terrified of being powerless. They don't build things, they just put things in cages." He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. "I grew up with nothing, in a part of this city you've never seen. I learned early that the world is divided into two kinds of people, the ones who lock the cages, and the ones who get locked in." It was the most he had ever revealed of himself to anyone. It was a glimpse into the furnace that had forged him. He wasn't just her savior, he was her kin, a fellow survivor of a different kind of cage. In his admission, she found not fear, but a deep, resonant understanding. He wasn't helping her out of charity. He was helping her because he understood, on a primal level, the fundamental horror of being controlled. A fragile, unspoken bond formed between them in that moment, woven from the threads of their shared pain and their silent recognition of the darkness in the world. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Arthur looked from her face to the sprawling lights of the city below, a kingdom he knew how to navigate. A cold, determined look settled in his eyes. "Now," he said, his voice laced with the ice of a promise, "I erase him." Walter Vance woke to an empty bed and a silence that felt unnervingly absolute. It wasn't the absence of Evelyn's soft breathing that alerted him, but the void where her fear used to be. The house felt hollow, stripped of the tension that was its lifeblood. Fury, cold and pure, rose in him like a tide. His property had been stolen. He unleashed his particular brand of chaos upon the city. He called the police commissioner, a man who owed him a dozen favors, reporting his wife as a hysterical, mentally unstable runaway who needed to be brought back for her own good. He hired a team of brutal private investigators, men who operated in the city's grimy underbelly, promising a handsome reward for her return, no questions asked. He leveraged his financial power, leaning on bankers and businessmen, spreading the word that anyone found aiding Evelyn Vance would find their credit lines severed and their contracts voided. The city became a web, and he was the enraged spider at its center. From the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, Evelyn watched the newsprint tell the story. The papers painted her as a troubled socialite, a flighty creature overcome by her delicate nerves. Walter was the long-suffering husband, worried sick for her safety. The lie was so complete, so publicly accepted, that it made her feel as if she were dissolving. "He's making me disappear," she whispered, her hands clenched around a copy of the Daily Chronicle. "He's turning me into a fiction." Arthur took the newspaper from her, crumpled it into a ball without reading it, and tossed it into the fireplace. "Words on cheap paper," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're meaningless. All that matters is what we do now." What Arthur did was wage a war. It was not a war of headlines and public pleas, but one fought in the shadows, with the cold, silent weapons of information and influence. He operated from his office at the Velvet Shadow, a general in his command post, moving his pieces across the city's board with lethal precision. He started with Walter's finances. One of Arthur's silent partners was a man deep within the city's largest bank. A quiet word, a hint of a federal investigation into Vance's less-than-legal import practices. And suddenly, Walter's lines of credit began to tighten. A major construction loan for a new skyscraper was mysteriously delayed, the paperwork lost in a bureaucratic quagmire that Arthur had personally constructed. Next, he targeted Walter's political shield. Arthur knew which city councilmen had gambling debts, which judges had mistresses, which union leaders were skimming from the pension funds. A series of anonymous tips, delivered via telegram and untraceable messengers, began to circulate through the halls of power. Men who had once eagerly taken Walter's calls now found it prudent to be perpetually unavailable. His shield was cracking. Evelyn saw little of this war, but she felt its tremors. Arthur would be gone for long stretches, returning late at night, the scent of the city, cold air, cigar smoke, and power clinging to his coat. He never spoke of the details, but she saw the grim satisfaction in his eyes, the hard set of his jaw. She saw the calculated cruelty he was capable of, and a part of her was terrified. This was the man who had saved her. But he was also a man who could dismantle her life with the same quiet efficiency with which he had orchestrated her escape. Their life in the penthouse became a strange, suspended reality. The terror of her past was gone, but the uncertainty of the future was a constant presence. During the day, They existed in a bubble of quiet domesticity. Arthur had the apartment stocked with books, art supplies, and a gramophone with a collection of jazz records that ranged from the mournful blues of Bessie Smith to the exuberant improvisations of Louis Armstrong. He taught her how to play gin rummy, his long, capable fingers shuffling the cards with practiced ease. He would watch, a small, rare smile touching his lips, as she sketched the cityscape in a charcoal pad he had bought for her, her brow furrowed in concentration. In these quiet moments, the bond forged in the desperation of their first meeting began to deepen into something else. It was in the way he'd place a blanket over her shoulders when she fell asleep reading on the sofa. It was in the way her hand would instinctively find his when a newsboy shouting headlines on the street below made her jump. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their disparate pasts, her constrained, gilded childhood, his brutal, orphaned one. They were two sides of the same coin, both shaped by the cages the world had tried to build around them. One evening, as a slow, romantic melody drifted from the gramophone, Arthur took her hand. "I never learned to do this properly," he murmured, leading her to the open space in the center of the room. He placed one hand on her waist, taking hers with his other. They began to move, a slow, slightly clumsy waltz, guided by the music and the city lights. Evelyn rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. The scent of him whiskey, clean linen, and something uniquely his, something like strength and shadows, filled her senses. In the circle of his arms, surrounded by the silent, violent war being waged in her name, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was not the performative dancing of the galas, the stiff, formal movements with her husband. This was a silent conversation. She lifted her head, and his face was very close, his grey eyes softened by the dim light. The space between them crackled with a tension far more potent than fear. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was hungry, desperate, a release of all the unspoken words, the shared pain, the burgeoning hope that had grown between them. It was a confirmation that this, whatever it was real. It was a rose blooming in the middle of a battlefield, its beauty all the more poignant for the violence that surrounded it. But the thorns were always present. One night, Frank arrived at the apartment, his face grim. He spoke to Arthur in a low, urgent tone by the door. Evelyn couldn't hear the words, but she saw the shift in Arthur's posture, the way his body tightened with a familiar, dangerous stillness. When he came back into the room, his face was a mask of cold resolve. "Walter's investigators are getting closer," he said, his voice flat. "They tracked the maid who delivered your note. It won't be long before they start connecting the dots to me, to this place, the fragile piece of their paradise, shattered. The real world, with all its ugliness, was clawing at the windows. He's not just a spider anymore," Arthur continued, his eyes locking with hers, and she saw the weight of the decision he was about to make. "He's a wounded animal, and a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind. He won't stop until he has you back, or until he's destroyed." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Evelyn's stomach. "What are we going to do?" Arthur's expression was grim. "I'm going to finish this. But to do that, I need to know you're safe, completely out of his reach. I can't fight him with one hand tied behind my back, always looking over my shoulder for you." The price of her paradise, she realized, was to be separated from the man who had built it for her. The war to secure her freedom required her absence from the battlefield. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart, but she saw the brutal logic in his words. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He was asking her to trust him, to leave the safety of his arms and believe that he would come back for her. After a lifetime of broken promises, it was the greatest leap of faith she had ever been asked to take. "Do you believe that love can overcome time and distance? Let me know in the comments." The journey was a blur of steel and steam, a flight conducted under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness. Arthur didn't entrust her to anyone else. He drove her himself in a nondescript Ford sedan, far less conspicuous than his Duesenberg, to a small, rural train station miles outside the city limits. The air on the platform was crystalline and cold, smelling of pine and coal smoke, a world away from the penthouse's perfumed safety. He pressed a thick envelope of cash and a one-way ticket into her hand. The destination was a pseudonym, Mrs. Clara Howard, traveling to a sleepy coastal town in Maine she had never heard of. "Frank has arranged everything," he said, his voice a low rumble against the hiss of the approaching train. "It's a small cottage, very isolated. No one will find you there. No one knows the location but Frank and me." Evelyn clutched the ticket, the sharp corner of the cardstock digging into her palm. "How long?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Arthur's gaze was intense, his grey eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. He reached out and gently brushed a stray auburn curl from her cheek, his touch both a comfort and a sharp, painful reminder of what she was about to lose. "As long as it takes to burn his world to the ground," he promised. "I will not come for you, Evelyn. Not until I can guarantee that his shadow will never touch you again. Not until I can offer you a life, not just a hiding place." The train groaned to a halt, a great iron beast breathing clouds of steam into the twilight. A conductor called out the boarding order. Their time was up. Impulsively, Evelyn threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the rough wool of his overcoat. She breathed in his scent, trying to brand it into her memory. He held her tightly, his arms a circle of strength, a final fleeting moment of sanctuary. "Write to me," she pleaded into his shoulder. "Let me know you're all right." "Every week," he vowed, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "General delivery, under your new name. I will find a way." He released her, his hands lingering on her arms for a moment before he stepped back. "Go now." Boarding the train was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every instinct screamed for her to stay. As she found a seat by a grimy window, she looked out and saw him standing on the empty platform, a solitary, immoving figure growing smaller and smaller as the train pulled away, until he was finally swallowed by the encroaching dawn. The cottage in Maine was exactly as he'd described, isolated, simple, and painfully beautiful. It sat on a rocky bluff overlooking the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The air was scoured clean by the salt wind, and the only sounds were the cry of gulls and the eternal rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. It was a place for forgetting, a place for healing, but for Evelyn, it was a beautiful prison of waiting. Her days fell into a quiet, lonely rhythm. She walked for hours along the windswept beach, collecting sea glass and watching the tides. She sketched the dramatic, moody coastline, filling pages with charcoal gray waves and stark black rocks. She read the books Arthur had sent ahead, his selections, tallies of adventure, poetry of longing, histories of forgotten wars, a strange and intimate window into his soul. But every activity was just a way to mark time, to fill the agonizingly slow hours between one week and the next. True to his word, the letters began to arrive. They were her lifeline, delivered in plain, sturdy envelopes to the small-town post office. They were penned in his strong, decisive script. He never wrote of the specifics of his war with Walter, never mentioned the violence or the danger. His letters were a deliberate and gentle act of construction, building for her an image of the future he was fighting for. "Evelyn," one began, "today I passed a music shop and heard a saxophone. It reminded me of the first time I saw you. I bought the record. I will play it for you when you come home." Another read, "The city is cold without you. I walk by the park and can still see you standing at the penthouse window. I am clearing the ground, my love. Soon we will be able to build something that will last." She read each letter 100 times, her fingers tracing the ink of his name. She kept them tied in a silk ribbon in her bedside table, a tangible record of his promise. Her own replies were filled with the quiet details of her life, the color of the sunset, the shape of a peculiar shell she had found, the progress of a small garden she had started. She poured all of her longing, her hope, and her unwavering trust onto the page, sending her heart back to him across the miles. Meanwhile, in the city, the war escalated. Arthur Sterling was no longer just a defender. He was an aggressor, moving with a cold, relentless fury. With Walter's finances crippled and his political allies deserting him, Arthur began the final phase of his assault, the complete destruction of Walter's reputation. He used his network to leak stories to the press, not the sanitized fictions Walter had concocted, but the sordid, verifiable truths. A reporter with a taste for scandal and a deeper fear of Arthur's displeasure began to print articles about Walter's brutal union-busting tactics, his fraudulent business contracts, the suspicious accidents at his factories. The whispers that had once been confined to back rooms now echoed in the headlines. The public image of the long-suffering husband began to crumble, revealing the tyrant beneath. Walter, cornered and bleeding from 1,000 cuts, grew increasingly unhinged. He became a recluse in his own mansion, drinking heavily, consumed by a paranoid obsession with finding Evelyn and destroying the man who had taken her. He fired his investigators, convinced they were incompetent, and began his own desperate, clumsy search. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, a jailer with no one left to imprison but himself. His rage, with nowhere else to go, festered and grew into a malignant poison. Arthur felt the net tightening. He knew that the war was nearing its climax. He could feel Walter's desperation, a palpable force in the city's atmosphere. Frank brought him daily reports of Walter's erratic behavior, of his frantic inquiries, of the rumors that he was losing his mind. One rain-lashed evening, as Arthur sat in his office reading Evelyn's latest letter, one that spoke of planting roses and dreaming of their future, Frank entered, his face pale. "Boss," he said, his voice grim, "we have a problem. A big one." He laid a telegram on the desk. It was from one of his contacts in the postal service. "Vance has been a ghost for weeks," Frank explained, "but he surfaced this afternoon. He was at the main post office, leaning on a clerk, bribing him, threatening him. He was asking about mail being sent to a Mrs. Clara Howard, specifically, mail being forwarded to a general delivery address in a small town in Maine." Arthur's blood ran cold. The image of Evelyn, alone and unprotected, flashed in his mind. He had been so careful, but he had underestimated the singular, obsessive focus of a ruined man. Walter had nothing left to lose, which made him the most dangerous adversary of all. He had found her lifeline, the one fragile thread that still connected them, and now he was following it to its source. Arthur stood up, his chair scraping back harshly. The time for whispers and strategy was over. The time for war had come to the door. "Get the car ready, Frank," he said, his voice deadly calm, "and pack my gun. The war isn't over. It just changed locations." The Duesenberg devoured the miles, its powerful engine a low, guttural roar that echoed Arthur's own contained fury. He drove through the night and into the next day, stopping only for gasoline. His entire being narrowed to a single, desperate point of focus: Evelyn. He had constructed a fortress of distance and secrecy to protect her, but with one lucky, desperate guess, Walter had found the key. Arthur had imagined their reunion 100 different ways: a quiet embrace on a sunlit train platform, a shared glass of champagne in the reclaimed penthouse, but never this. Never a frantic, desperate race against a madman. In the small cottage on the bluff, Evelyn was blissfully unaware. The day was crisp and clear, the autumn sun casting a golden sheen on the roiling Atlantic. She had spent the morning in her garden, her hands covered in rich, dark earth, feeling a sense of peace that had been slowly, tentatively, taking root in her soul. She was humming a jazz tune from one of Arthur's records as she walked the short, sandy path to the mailbox at the edge of the property. She was hoping for a letter. Instead, she found Walter. He was standing there, leaning against the weathered wood of the mailbox post, a caricature of his former self. His expensive suit was rumpled and stained. His face was pale and puffy from alcohol, and his eyes held a wild, feverish gleam. A Ford Model T, splattered with mud from a long and arduous journey, was parked haphazardly on the dirt road behind him. Evelyn froze, the blood draining from her face. The peaceful sounds of the ocean and the gulls were instantly replaced by a roaring in her ears. He was an apparition from a past she had believed was buried, a ghost rising from a grave she had not dug deep enough. "Hello, my dear," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" She took a step back, her mind scrambling, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where? The cottage was behind her, the empty beach to her side, the vast ocean beyond. There was nowhere to go. "Walter," she said, her own voice a fragile whisper, "what are you doing here?" "Leave." He laughed, a ragged, ugly sound that was utterly devoid of humor. "Leave? I've come to take you home, Evelyn. I've lost everything because of you. My business, my reputation, my good name. But I will not lose my wife." He took a step toward her, his movements unsteady, but propelled by a terrifying singular purpose. "You belong to me. That gutter rat you ran off with needs to be taught that. He is a better man than you will ever be," she shot back, a spark of defiance flaring through her terror. The months of solitude and self-reflection had given her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She was no longer the silent, trembling doll from the mansion. Her defiance seemed to enrage him further. He lunged, grabbing her arm in a punishing grip. "You will learn your place again," he snarled, his face inches from hers, the sour smell of whiskey on his breath. He began to drag her toward his car, her feet scraping against the sandy soil. It was then that the low, menacing growl of a powerful engine filled the air. The black Duesenberg appeared at the crest of the road, a sleek, dark predator against the bright blue sky. It slid to a halt, kicking up a cloud of dust, and Arthur stepped out. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked toward them, his long overcoat billowing in the sea breeze, his face a mask of cold, lethal calm. He looked at Walter's hand on Evelyn's arm, and his grey eyes, which she had only ever known to hold warmth for her, turned to chips of ice. Walter stopped, his grip on Evelyn tightening. He shoved her behind him, using her as a shield. "Sterling," he spat. "Come to admire your handiwork. She is still mine. She will always be mine." Arthur came to a stop about 10 feet away. He ignored Walter completely, his entire attention fixed on Evelyn. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady, cutting through the tension. "No," she managed to say, her eyes pleading with him. "Good," Arthur said. He then shifted his gaze to Walter, and the full, terrifying force of his quiet fury was finally unleashed. "Let her go, Vance." It was not a request. It was a command that expected absolute obedience. Driven by a final, pathetic surge of possessive rage, Walter made his last mistake. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, silver-plated pistol. It trembled in his unsteady hand. "She's coming with me," he hissed, pressing the cold metal against Evelyn's temple. "Or she's not leaving with anyone." Evelyn gasped, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. But Arthur didn't even flinch. His expression did not change. He seemed utterly unimpressed by the gun. "You won't use that, Walter," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried with chilling clarity on the wind. "You are a coward." You only hurt people who can't fight back. You hide in your big house, and you hurt your wife because it makes you feel powerful. But you don't have the stomach for this." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Stay back," Walter shrieked, his voice cracking, his knuckles white on the grip of the pistol. Arthur took another step. "You've already lost everything," he continued, his voice weaving a hypnotic, damning spell. "Your money is gone. Your friends have abandoned you. Your name is mud. This is all you have left. This one pathetic, final act of control. But you see, you don't even have that anymore. Look at her, Walter. Look at her eyes. She's not afraid of you. She's afraid of the gun, but she's not afraid of you. Not anymore." For a fatal second, Walter's gaze flickered to Evelyn's face, seeking the familiar terror he thrived on, only to find a new, defiant strength. That moment of distraction was all Arthur needed. He moved with a speed that was stunning, closing the distance between them in a blur. He didn't go for the gun. He grabbed the front of Walter's jacket, yanking him forward and away from Evelyn. At the same time, his other hand chopped down on Walter's wrist. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the quiet air. The pistol clattered uselessly to the ground. Walter screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and shock. Arthur spun him around and slammed him against the side of the Model T. He didn't hit him. He didn't need to. He simply leaned in close, his face a mask of pure, controlled menace. "I'm not going to kill you," Arthur whispered, his voice a venomous promise. "That would be too easy. A grave is too permanent. People visit graves. I am going to erase you. You are going to get in your car, and you are going to drive away. You will never come near her again. You will never speak her name again. You will cease to exist, because if I ever see your face again, if I ever hear your name whispered on the wind, I will find you, and I will dismantle you so completely, there won't be enough left to bury." He released him. Walter stumbled back, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of agony and utter, abject terror. He had finally met a power greater and far more terrifying than his own. He looked from Arthur's unforgiving face to Evelyn, who stood watching, free and resolute. Defeated, he scrambled into his car, started the engine with a roar of panic and sped away, disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of shame and dust. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the cry of a distant gull. Arthur kicked the fallen pistol into the tall grass, out of sight. Then he turned to Evelyn. The mask of fury fell away, replaced by a look of profound, aching relief. He opened his arms, and she ran into them, burying herself against his chest, the solid, living proof that he had kept his promise. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on the top of her head, as they both trembled from the violent conclusion of a war that had finally, blessedly, ended. The past was not just buried, it had been erased. The return journey to the city felt nothing like the flight from it. They traveled not in darkness and fear, but in the soft, hopeful light of a new day, the Duesenberg gliding smoothly over the roads. Evelyn sat close to Arthur, her hand resting on his arm, finding a simple, profound comfort in his physical presence. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken words or anxieties, but light with the promise of a future they could now claim as their own. The ghost of Walter Vance was gone, banished not just from her life, but from the spaces in her mind he had occupied for so long. They did not return to the penthouse. Arthur drove past the familiar skyline, heading north of the city, where the tightly packed buildings gave way to rolling hills and sprawling estates hidden behind old stone walls. He turned onto a long, winding driveway, flanked by ancient maple trees, their leaves a riot of autumn gold and crimson. At the end of the drive sat a house. It wasn't a mansion, in the oppressive, monolithic style of Walter's home. This was a beautiful stone and timber country house, with large, welcoming windows and ivy climbing the walls. It looked as if it had grown organically from the landscape, a place of peace and permanence. Smoke curled gently from a chimney, a welcoming plume against the crisp blue sky. "What is this place?" Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with awe. "I bought it a month ago," Arthur said, turning to her, a rare, soft smile on his lips. "I told you I was clearing the ground. I thought we might need a place to build." This, she realized, was the paradise he had been fighting for. Not a gilded cage or a temporary hiding place, but a home, a sanctuary. Inside, the house was filled with light. The rooms were spacious and airy, with polished hardwood floors, comfortable-looking furniture, and walls lined with books. In the main living area, a grand piano stood gleaming by a set of French doors that opened onto a stone terrace overlooking a vast, serene lake. On the mantelpiece, above a crackling fire, sat a single, framed photograph, a candid shot Frank had taken of Evelyn sketching by the window in the penthouse, lost in her work. Arthur had not just built a refuge, he had built a life, waiting for her to step into it. But the days that followed were a gentle unfolding. The frantic, desperate passion forged in danger and secrecy slowly transformed into a deep, abiding intimacy. They discovered the quiet, mundane beauty of a life shared. They took long walks by the lake, their hands intertwined. They cooked meals together in the large, warm kitchen, their laughter echoing in the quiet house. Arthur, a man who had commanded a shadow empire, found a surprising joy in simple tasks, like chopping wood for the fire or fixing a loose shutter. He was a different man here, away from the grit and noise of the city. The hard edges she had seen, the cold resolve of the warrior, softened. He still possessed a core of immense strength and stillness, but it was now the strength of a great oak, not a drawn blade. He would read to her in the evenings by the fire, his low voice a comforting rumble. He would sit for hours at the piano, his long fingers, once used for counting illicit cash and shuffling cards, now coaxing beautiful, melancholic melodies from the ivory keys, music he had composed himself, full of a longing and a hope he had never been able to put into words. Evelyn in turn began to heal. The faint shadows of bruises had long since faded, but now the deeper, invisible wounds began to close. She filled the house with flowers from the garden and the scent of baking bread. She rediscovered her art, her sketches no longer filled with the stormy, brooding seascapes of her exile, but with the soft light on Arthur's face as he read, the play of sunlight on the lake, the vibrant colors of the autumn leaves. For the first time since she was a young girl, her smile reached her eyes. She was no longer a reflection in someone else's mirror, but a woman standing in her own light. One cool evening, they stood on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep purple. Arthur wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "Are you happy, Evelyn?" he asked quietly, his lips close to her ear. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes and breathing in the clean, crisp air. The word happy felt too small, too simple for the profound sense of peace and rightness that filled her. It was more than happiness. It was a homecoming for a soul that had been wandering for a very long time. "I was a ghost," she murmured, thinking back to the woman in the beaded dress at the velvet shadow. "You gave me a life." "No," he corrected her gently, his arms tightening around her. "You were always alive. You just needed the freedom to remember it." He turned her in his arms to face him. In the fading light, his grey eyes were filled with an emotion so deep and sincere, it stole her breath. There were no more secrets, no more shadows between them. The gangster who had rescued her had done more than erase her past. He had given her a future, and the abused wife he had found cowering in a gilded cage was gone, replaced by the strong, vibrant woman who now stood before him. He lowered his head and kissed her, not with the desperation of their first encounter, but with the quiet, confident promise of 1,000 sunsets to come. It was a kiss that spoke of healing, of peace, and of a love that had been forged in the darkest of fires, only to emerge into the bright, clear dawn of a new era. In the sanctuary they had built together, their paradise was finally, truly, real. True love is not about possession, but about liberation. It is a sanctuary built not to confine, but to give a wounded soul the freedom to heal and remember its own strength. The greatest paradise is not a place of luxury, but a state of peace found in the arms of someone who would wage a war to protect it. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more timeless romances.